The search and rescue teams in the Great Smoky Mountains have a golden rule. They never tell civilian volunteers. If you find a perfectly clean pair of boots sitting in the middle of an untouched briar patch, you don't look for the owner, you run. David Miller knew the Great Smoky Mountains like the back of his hand. As a veteran search and rescue SAR officer with 12 years on the bottom, he had tracked lost hikers, handled bear encounters, and survived freezing nights under the dense canopy. But the summer of 2024 brought a missing person case that defied every metric of logic. A 7-year-old boy named Leo Vance had vanished during a family camping trip near Cades Cove. One moment he was throwing pebbles into a shallow creek. The next, he was gone. There were no tracks, no scuffle marks, and no blood. It was as if the forest had simply opened its mouth and swallowed him whole. By day 4, the official search was scaling down, but David couldn't let it go. He knew the statistics. After 96 hours in these rugged woods, a child's chances plummeted. He decided to push deeper into an off-trail sector known as the Devil's Elbow, a treacherous, heavily forested ridge where the canopy was so thick it choked out the sun even at noon. The silence in the Devil's Elbow was total. No birds chirped, no insects buzzed. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that made your ears ring. David checked his GPS. The screen flickered violently, the cursor spinning in tight circles before the unit died completely. He cursed under his breath, relying on his compass. That's when he smelled it. It wasn't the scent of decay or wild animals. It was the sharp, synthetic smell of ozone and copper, like an electrical fire in an old basement. David pushed past a wall of dense rhododendron bushes and froze. In a small, circular clearing where the grass had been inexplicably flattened into a perfect ring, sat Leo's bright red hiking boots. They were pristine, no mud on the soles, no scuffs on the leather, completely dry, despite a torrential downpour the previous evening. They were placed neatly together, pointing toward the dark trunk of an ancient, hollow oak tree. "Leo?" David called out, his voice sounding flat and swallowed by the moss-covered trees. A sound came from inside the hollow oak. It was a rhythmic, wet clicking noise, followed by a voice that made David's spine turn to ice. "David, I'm so cold. Help me off the ridge." It sounded exactly like Leo Vance. It had the same childish lisp, the same pitch. But the cadence was wrong. The words were spaced out with mathematical precision, completely devoid of the panic or exhaustion a lost child would have. It sounded like someone playing a distorted audio clip through a broken speaker. David drew his sidearm, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Leo, step out of the tree slowly. Keep your hands where I can see them." The clicking noise grew louder, resembling thousands of beetles crawling over dry leaves. From the darkness of the hollow trunk, a figure began to squeeze itself out. It wore Leo's blue windbreaker, but the proportions were horrifyingly mutated. The arms were nearly twice as long as they should have been, the elbow bending backward with sickening snaps. The head was tilted at an impossible 90-degree angle, and when it caught the dim light filtering through the trees, David realized there were no features on its face. Just a smooth, pale membrane where eyes and a mouth should be. Yet, the voice echoed directly from the center of its chest. "David, it's dark down here. The trees have so many eyes." Terror, raw and primal, overrode David's training. He fired 3 rounds into the center mass of the creature. The bullets tore through the windbreaker, but instead of blood, a thick black tar-like sap oozed from the wounds. The entity didn't flinch. It began to scuttle toward him on all fours, its elongated limbs clicking against the forest floor with terrifying speed. David turned and bolted. He didn't care about navigation or protocol. He just needed to escape the Devil's Elbow. Behind him, the forest came alive. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches clawing at his face and tearing his uniform. And everywhere, from every direction in the canopy, the voice of Leo Vance echoed in unison, amplified by 1,000 invisible throats. "Why are you running, David? We just want to show you where the others go." David sprinted until his lungs burned and his vision blurred. He tripped over an exposed root, tumbling down a steep embankment and crashing into a shallow rocky stream. The impact knocked the wind out of him, but the shock of the cold water cleared his head. He looked back up the ridge. The chase had stopped at the tree line. Standing at the edge of the dark woods, just out of the sunlight, were dozens of figures. Some wore the tattered clothes of hikers who had gone missing decades ago. Others were barely shaped like humans at all. They stood completely still, watching him with their blank, featureless faces. David dragged himself down the stream bed until he finally hit a main trail and encountered a park ranger patrol. He was hyperventilating, covered in mud and deep lacerations. 3 weeks later, Leo Vance was found alive. He was discovered sitting on a boulder 12 miles away from where he disappeared, in an area that had been searched multiple times. He had no signs of dehydration, exposure, or starvation. But when David went to visit the family, he stood outside the hospital room window and watched the boy. Leo was staring blankly at the wall, his fingers twitching in a rhythmic, wet clicking pattern against the bed sheets. David resigned from the National Park Service the next day. He moved to the desert of Arizona, far away from anything that resembled a tree. Because even now, when the wind blows through the night, he swears he can hear the distant, synchronized whispering of the woods, calling him back to the ridge. A remote cabin in the dead of winter is supposed to provide peace. But when the snow turns dark crimson overnight and the deer start walking upright on their hind legs, you realize you aren't isolated, you're cornered. The north woods of Maine in January are unforgiving. For miles in every direction, there is nothing but frozen pine trees, deep drifts of snow, and a biting wind that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. Thomas Vance, a novelist seeking absolute isolation to finish his thriller, thought the old hunting cabin near the Canadian border was paradise. He wanted silence. He wanted to be alone. He got exactly what he asked for, and it became his living nightmare. The trouble began on the 5th night. A massive blizzard had rolled in, burying the cabin up to the porch railings. The temperature dropped to -30 degrees. Thomas sat by the roaring stone fireplace, sipping black coffee, when he heard a heavy thud against the heavy oak front door. It wasn't the sound of the wind. It was a deliberate, heavy impact, like a fist hitting wood. Thomas frowned, setting his mug down. He grabbed a flashlight and his hunting rifle, stepping cautiously to the window beside the door. He wiped away the frost and peered out into the howling white darkness. Standing in the deep snow just beyond the porch was a massive white-tailed buck. Its antlers were enormous, jagged, and caked in frozen velvet. But the deer wasn't acting like a wild animal. It was standing completely upright on its hind legs, its front hooves hanging limply at its chest like a grotesque parody of a human stance. Its head was cocked slightly, and its eyes, unblinking and glowing with a faint, unnatural yellow luminescence, were fixed directly on Thomas through the glass. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out despite the heat from the fireplace. He banged on the window pane to scare it off. Go on!" The creature didn't bolt. Instead, it slowly opened its mouth, stretching its jaw down past its structural limits until the skin tore at the hinges. A low, vibrating hum emitted from its throat, a sound that resonated in Thomas's teeth and made his stomach churn. Then, with a sudden, jerky movement, it dropped back onto all fours and vanished into the swirling snow. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He piled heavy furniture against the door and kept his rifle loaded across his lap. When dawn finally broke, the storm had passed, leaving behind an eerie, blinding brightness. Thomas pushed open the window to inspect the porch. What he saw made him drop his rifle. The pristine white snow surrounding the cabin was gone. For a radius of 50 yards, the snow had turned a deep, glistening crimson, as if thousands of gallons of fresh blood had been sprayed across the landscape. The iron-rich, metallic stench was overwhelming, hanging thick in the sub-zero air. Sweeping across the crimson expanse were hundreds of tracks, not hoof prints, but the unmistakable imprints of naked, elongated human feet. His truck wouldn't start. The engine block was completely frozen, and the battery was dead. His phone had no service. The nearest town was a 20-mile trek through waist-deep snow. He was trapped. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across the red snow, Thomas heard the radio in the kitchen turn on by itself. The static was deafening, a harsh roar that suddenly cut into a clear broadcast. But it wasn't music or news, it was Thomas's own voice. "It's so beautiful out here, Thomas." The radio played back his own voice, distorted but recognizable. "The snow is warm. Come outside and see what we built for you." Thomas ran to the kitchen and ripped the power cord from the wall. The radio kept playing. He grabbed a hatchet and smashed the plastic casing into splinters, but the audio continued to echo from the shattered speakers, growing louder, more frantic. Suddenly, the generator outside cut out. The cabin plunged into darkness, save for the dying embers of the fireplace. From the roof directly above his head came the sound of heavy, dragging footsteps. Thud, thud, thud. Something massive was pacing back and forth across the shingles. Then the scratching began, hundreds of sharp, bony points scraping against the wood, searching for a seam, an opening, a way inside. "Leave me alone," Thomas screamed, aiming his rifle at the ceiling. A face pressed against the skylight in the living room. It was no longer just a deer. It was a shifting mass of pale, frostbitten flesh, an amalgamation of missing hikers and forest animals fused together into a horrific entity. Multiple eyes blink in unison from its torso, and a dozen human hands scratch frantically at the glass. The skeletal head of the buck cracked against the window pane, leaving a web of fractures in the glass. The glass shattered. Thomas fired wildly into the dark as the entity poured into the living room like a heavy, suffocating shadow. The air instantly turned freezing, his breath pluming in white clouds as the fire was snuffed out by a blast of Arctic wind. He felt long, skeletal fingers caked in frozen blood wrap around his ankles, dragging him toward the broken window. The last thing Thomas saw before he was pulled into the red winter night was the endless stretch of the Maine woods, where every single pine tree was encrusted with ice, and thousands of upright, glowing-eyed figures stood in the dark, waiting for him to join the chorus. When you go camping in the Pacific Northwest, they tell you to lock your tents and never look up into the trees after midnight. They don't tell you that the trees can mimic the exact voice of your mother crying for help. The Cascade Range in Washington state holds secrets that date back long before European settlers ever set foot on the continent. The local indigenous tribes have stories about things that live in the deep valleys, things that wear the skins of men but possess the souls of monsters. Elena and Marcus were experienced backpackers. They had tackled the Pacific Crest Trail and spent weeks in the backcountry without incident. For their anniversary, they chose a secluded, unmapped valley near Mount Baker, one away from the crowded tourist campgrounds. They pitched their tent in a small meadow surrounded by towering, ancient Douglas firs that stood like silent sentinels. The first 2 days were idyllic, but on the third night, the atmosphere of the valley shifted. It started with the dogs. A few miles away, a pack of coyotes began to howl. But as the minutes ticked by, the howling changed. The wild, high-pitched yapping devolved into agonizing screams of pain, followed by a wet, tearing sound. Then, silence. Marcus stepped outside the tent to stoke the dying campfire. "Hey, Elena, grab the bear spray, will you? Something's weird out here." Elena handed it to him through the tent flap. "Did you hear that? It sounded like they were being eaten alive." "Just nature being brutal," Marcus said, trying to sound confident, though his hand trembled as he gripped the canister. An hour later, they crawled into their sleeping bags, keeping a lantern burning low between them. Sleep escaped Elena. Every time she closed her eyes, she felt an intense wave of paranoia, a sensation of being watched by a hostile, predatory intelligence. At 2:15 a.m., a voice drifted through the thin nylon wall of the tent. "Elena, sweetie, are you in there? I got lost looking for the trail." Elena sat upright, her heart freezing in her chest. The voice belonged to her mother, Clara. It had the exact nervous tremor, the same Midwestern accent. But Clara was currently in an assisted living facility in Ohio, thousands of miles away. "Marcus," Elena whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Marcus, wake up." Marcus groaned, blinking awake. "What? What's wrong?" "Marcus, help me. My ankle is broken." The voice outside called out again, closer this time, right at the edge of the tree line. It's so dark out here. Please open the tent. Marcus froze, his eyes widening. That sounds like your mom. How is that possible? It's not her, Elena hissed, tears of absolute terror streaming down her face. My mom can't walk without a walker, Marcus. That is not her. Marcus grabbed his heavy hunting knife and a high-lumen flashlight. Against Elena's frantic protests, he unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. He shone the beam of light into the dense wall of Douglas firs. The flashlight illuminated a figure standing 20 yards away. It had the shape of a woman wearing a faded floral nightgown, just like the ones Clara wore. But the body was wrong. It was nearly 7 feet tall, its skin a mottled, bruised gray that looked like rotting bark. Its neck was elongated, shifting and writhing like a nest of snakes underneath the flesh. As the flashlight beam hit its face, the entity smiled. The mouth opened impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth that resembled a shark's. It didn't have human eyes. Instead, its sockets were filled with a black, reflective fluid that caught the light. "Why won't you let me in, Elena?" the creature said, its jaw moving in perfect synchronization with her mother's voice. "I brought your favorite cookies. Open the door." "Jesus Christ," Marcus gasped, slamming the zipper down and locking it. "Get your pack. We need to leave, now." But before they could even move, a massive weight slammed onto the top of the tent. The nylon ripped open with a loud shriek, and the heavy, muscular torso of a gray wolf descended into the space between them. Except the wolf had human arms ending in long, black talons. Marcus lunged forward with his knife, burying it deep into the creature's shoulder. The entity didn't cry out in pain. Instead, it emitted a deafening, metallic screech that shattered the lantern glass, plunging the tent into darkness. Lena scrambled backward out of the torn tent, falling into the damp grass of the meadow. In the moonlight, she saw Marcus being dragged backward into the dark forest by his legs. He was screaming her name, his fingers clawing desperately into the dirt, leaving deep furrows in the earth. "Marcus!" she screamed, running toward the tree line, but the shadows of the Cascades swallowed him whole. His screams abruptly ended with a sickening, wet crunch. Elena ran. She didn't look back. She sprinted through the dark woods, relying entirely on the faint moonlight filtering through the canopy. Behind her, she could hear the entity pursuing her. It was changing forms as it ran, the heavy thudding of a bear's paws, the light scuttling of a deer, the heavy footsteps of a man. And as it chased her, it used Marcus's voice. "Elena, wait! I escaped! I'm hurt! Please help me!" Marcus's voice cried out from the darkness to her left. Then from her right, "Elena, why did you leave me to die? It hurts so much!" She covered her ears, screaming at the top of her lungs to drown out the mimicry. She ran until the sun began to rise, finally breaking through the tree line onto a logging road where a passing timber truck found her collapsing from exhaustion and shock. The authorities launched a massive search of the valley, but they found nothing. No tent, no blood, no signs of Marcus or any predatory animals. The valley was completely pristine. Elena now lives in a high-rise apartment in Seattle. She never goes below the 4th floor, and she keeps her windows sealed shut. But sometimes, when the fog rolls off the mountains and blankets the city, her Alexa unit turns on by itself in the dead of night, broadcasting the sound of Marcus's voice, whispering from the static, "We're just waiting for the next camping trip, Elena. The valley misses you."